got the protection money, boss's orders. It was the grand opening day of my father's long-awaited ramen shop. A man claiming to be a gangster who controlled this entire area showed up at the store on that very first day. He demanded money, and my furious father, Charles, decided to call in a certain someone. That brat, how dare he? Go get the boss. My father ordered, and I immediately made the call. 5 minutes later, the gang boss arrived, and I'm Nancy, 20 years old. I'm currently a college student, helping my mother prepare for the opening of my father's ramen shop. My mother has always been physically weak, so my father and I did most of the preparations. I was the one who inspired my father to open a ramen shop. My father has loved ramen since he was a child, and he says he was shocked the first time he tried it. He decided that when he grew up, he would open his own ramen shop to share that excitement with others. However, as an adult, my father gave up on that dream for a while to support us and joined a company with a stable income. It was a great workplace, and he enjoyed his job, but my father couldn't let go of his dream. When I declared that I had received a scholarship and was going to culinary school, my father shared his long-held dream of having his own ramen shop. That was the first time I learned about my father's passionate feelings. And I wanted to support him. By that time, my mother hardly needed any hospital expenses and was working part-time little by little, so I talked to her and decided to support my father. My father was hesitant, but encouraged by us, he made up his mind to open his long-cherished ramen shop. He was so happy preparing for the opening. But to think that such a thing would happen right after the opening. And I was about to witness a new reality. Opening day. My father's ramen shop is about a 10-minute walk from our house. It happened to be on land owned by an acquaintance, and my father said he was allowed to use it. My father was in high spirits from the morning and took care of most of the many preparations. My mother and I really enjoyed watching him like that. Moreover, although my father had been an employee for a long time, his ramen-making skills were first class. Apparently, he had been secretly researching ramen as a hobby, visiting various shops and eating ramen even on weekdays. The first time I tasted my father's ramen, I was amazed at how delicious it was. I grew to love my father's ramen very much. Before we knew it, it was time for the store to open. My father and I waited nervously, wondering what kind of people would come. Of course, for this day, I had advertised my father's store on social media and by distributing flyers. I also told my school friends and people at school. There's a discount for the first 3 days, so please come. And then we welcomed our first customers. My father's store has a small and cozy atmosphere, with a maximum capacity of 20 people, including the counter seats. Despite that, even more people visited the store, and everyone waited with a smile for a seat to become available while sniffing the delicious aroma of ramen. My father and I were so happy, and we served the customers with joy. However, an incident occurred that seemed to disrupt our happy feelings. It was that evening. The time when the flow of customers had calmed down. 2 men with bad attitude came to the store. My father and I thought they were the last customers and were serving them with a friendly demeanor. At first, they seemed like very nice people. But when we said we were closing the store for the day, their attitude suddenly changed. We're customers. We're still eating, aren't we? Are you telling us to leave already? They said in an intimidating tone, holding out their empty beer mugs. Looking at the table, they had already finished eating, and the last order had been taken, so we weren't saying anything unreasonable. I'm sorry, but please leave as it's closing time now. My father pleaded humbly, but the customers didn't stop their rough behavior. They smashed beer glasses and knocked over the bowls lined up on the table. Shut up! I'm a customer! The customer is always right. Drunk or not, the customer who introduced himself as Anthony stuck to his own claims. My father tried to persuade them several times with a troubled look, but the customers still wouldn't get up from their seats. I'm not paying for a place like this. After complaining endlessly, the customer finally threw down the bill, saying that. Then they walked to the store's entrance and roughly went outside. Dad, what should we do about the money? Well, they left, so let's just let it go. I hope customers like that will never come again. I witnessed rough customers for the first time and my heart was pounding with tension. But my father responded as if it was nothing and quickly moved on. And he had a smile on his face, saying that today was fun. If my father said so, I took a deep breath to calm myself down and started preparing to close the store for the day. The next day. The store was thriving again today. Many customers who couldn't come yesterday showed up. Also, people who came yesterday and liked the taste came again, and my father and I were very happy. My father seemed to remember the customers' faces quickly and actively talked to those who came yesterday. In the midst of this, those two men appeared in the store again. My father and I were on guard, and after taking their orders, we responded plainly. The two talked loudly without caring, acting as if nothing had happened yesterday. Seeing such an attitude, I felt somewhat unconvinced. And when the flow of customers had settled down, the two approached me with a malicious grin. I thought so yesterday too, but you're pretty. What's your name? I said. Nancy. Oh, nice to meet you, Nancy. Hey, let's hang out after this. Oh, I'm Anthony. Remember that. I'm a regular here, you know. I involuntarily widened my eyes. I felt absolutely disgusted and didn't even want to have a conversation, so I immediately refused, but the two still persistently pestered me. Troubled, I glanced at the kitchen where my father was, but he didn't notice what was happening to me in the dining area. Thinking I had to deal with it myself, I involuntarily tensed up. Hey, of course you'll hang out with us, right? Do you know what happens if you go against us? I'm sorry. I'll have to decline. I'm at work right now. Now, if you'll excuse me. As I said that and was about to move my feet to leave immediately, the man who had introduced himself as Anthony earlier grabbed my arm. Hey, wait. We're still in the middle of talking. Sit down there. Let's talk. There aren't many customers, so it should be fine. It was the same angry tone as yesterday. I felt I had made a mistake and reflexively pulled my hand away. Then Anthony, seemingly angered by this, raised his voice. Furthermore, he forcibly pulled my arm, trying to make me sit down, so other customers hurriedly told my father that the situation wasn't good. There were also people who stood between me and Anthony to stop him. However, Anthony pushed those customers away too and didn't stop his violent behavior. Are you looking down on me? I'm a gangster, you know. Want me to teach you what happens if you defy me? Anthony threatened loudly, and the surrounding customers cowered upon hearing those words. I also shrank back together with the customers. Then my father hurriedly rushed over. Stop it. If you cause any more trouble, I'll call the police. My father's calm voice was enough to restore our composure. I immediately stood up and hid behind my father. My father stood in the way with a resolute attitude, and for this moment, he looked really cool. Hearing the word police, Anthony also seemed to falter a little. You know what'll happen if you do that, right? He tried to threaten us, but there was more tension in his voice than before. Perhaps sensing that, my father maintained his resolute demeanor and told him, If you don't like it, just leave already. If you're going to do this to my daughter, don't ever come back." With just his gaze, my father urged Anthony toward the entrance. Anthony's face turned bright red, and he glared at my father with a very angry look. "I'll let it slide today, but I'll make you regret going against me." Anthony spat, dropped a nearby customer's plate on the floor, and left the store. After glaring at his retreating figure, my father apologized to the customers and offered complimentary drinks. The customers were frightened, but they seemed to feel reassured by my father's attitude. They left with smiles, saying they would come again. 3 days later, today was the final day of the discount. There were more people than the previous 2 days, making it a day fitting for the final push. We were busy from the morning, and both my father and I had forgotten about the previous day's events. That's when it happened. Even though the flow of customers hadn't died down yet, Anthony came with several people in tow. As soon as my father saw them, he immediately came out of the kitchen and stood in the way at the entrance. "You are banned from entering. I told you I would call the police if you caused any more trouble, didn't I?" Hey. We haven't done anything yet." Today, Anthony had a look on his face as if he was plotting something, and his tone was cheerful. What could he be scheming? Tension ran through me and the other customers. Then Anthony pushed my father aside and started hitting on a group of young women sitting nearby. I hurriedly yelled at him not to bother the other customers. "What's this? Jealous, Nancy? I don't dislike strong-willed women. If you want to hang out, you should just say so." "That's not it. You're bothering other people. If you insist that you're a customer, then sit in an empty seat." As soon as I pointed that out, my father pulled Anthony away from the customers. I really wanted to report him, so I started dialing the phone number. But that ended up being a dud. Because one of the men Anthony brought with him snatched the mobile phone out of my hand. "Stop! Give it back!" I got into a scuffle with the man who yelled at me not to do anything unnecessary, and my father immediately intervened, so I got my mobile phone back, but the man laughed mockingly. Out of the corner of his eye, Anthony spoke to my father. "We came to talk today." My father glared at Anthony as if on guard. I went around apologizing to the surrounding customers for causing them trouble. The customers were frightened, and some left money and walked out. Customers outside the store were also peering in with interest at the situation inside. There were even people filming what was happening inside with their mobile phones, and I resented Anthony from the bottom of my heart for ruining my father's dream opening. "Do you know whose land this is?" Anthony said with a laugh. "This is the land of the boss of a big organization that controls this whole area. I don't know how you got your hands on it, but you know what it means to open a store here, right?" "What do you mean?" my father asked, pretending not to know. Then Anthony deepened his smile and said, "You don't know anything, do you?" "I'm telling you to pay the protection money." "What? There's no such thing. We're paying rent, so we don't need that. Who are you?" At that, Anthony laughed as if he had been waiting for this moment and kicked a nearby chair in a victorious manner. When I raised my voice to try to stop him, Anthony shouted the name of his organization at a volume that drowned me out. "Pay up the protection money, boss's orders." At those words, my father raised his eyebrows. Then his face turned terrifying, and he glared at Anthony and his men. Seeing my father's face like that, Anthony and his men laughed as if they were scared, and spoke in a cocky manner. "It's natural if you're going to do business on the boss's turf, right? We were ordered to collect them. Because you were being too cheeky, we brought our guys along." When Anthony raised his hand, the men around him leaned forward. One man stepped forward and raised his fist. I thought about the impact that would come later and involuntarily held my breath. But my father didn't look away at all and kept staring at the man who had raised his fist. Anthony saw that and let out an amused laugh. "You've got guts. We can't have you making a mess in this store. Can't we settle this amicably?" My father asked in a low voice. The atmosphere was such that he wouldn't take no for an answer, but Anthony's voice bounced as if he had been set on fire. "Looks like you've been causing quite a ruckus. But you can't go against the real deal. We can't go easy on you after being disrespected this much." Anthony's words energized his underlings. I, who had been standing still beside my father, also had my arm grabbed and was taunted with mocking words. Seeing that, my father showed an angry expression. Anthony continued to taunt my father as if provoking him. "I'm saying I'll let it slide if you pay up quickly, so just pay obediently. And to apologize to us, you'll make the ramen free from now on, right?" He slapped my father's shoulder, which didn't budge an inch, and also looked at me in a vulgar way. My inner feelings were not calm. I wanted to call the police, but my body was restrained, and I couldn't move. The customers had already left, sensing the disturbing atmosphere, and the customers who had remained inside were also driven out by Anthony's underlings. The restaurant might go under on just the third day. My father's dream had finally come true, and I remembered his happy face as he prepared for the opening, feeling a sense of frustration welling up inside me. Looking at my father, his face was stiff with anger like I had never seen before, and he was gritting his back teeth in rage. "That brat and his nerve! Call him here!" My father's angry voice echoed. Anthony shrank back a little at the volume of his voice. "Call him here, you say? You don't mean the boss, do you?" "Of course. I'll have a good talk with him," my father said in a low voice. This was the first time I had seen my father's anger so intense. But I thought that if we called the boss, it would only make my position worse, but my father insisted on calling him and wouldn't back down. Seeing my father's stubborn attitude, Anthony shouted, "I won't be held responsible for what happens." But even so, he still didn't try to call. Unable to endure it, my father ordered me to bring his cell phone from the back. What on earth was he planning to do? That's what I thought, but I was released for a moment and went back to get my father's cell phone as if giving up. The atmosphere between my father and Anthony was on the verge of exploding the whole time. As soon as I returned, my father said, "There should be a name that says brother in the phone book on the cell phone. Call that number." "Okay." I immediately made the call. When the call connected, I heard the voice of a man who was a little younger than my father. I was a little surprised by his intimidating voice, but as soon as I gave my name, he became very friendly. When I told him that my father was calling for him, he said he would be here in 5 minutes. I called him. "Dad, I didn't know you had a younger brother." When I called out to him, "Yeah," my father answered curtly. This was the first time I had exchanged words with my father's relatives. It was 5 minutes later. Many black cars lined up outside. All the customers had already gone home, and the only ones there were my father, me, and Anthony and his gang. "You didn't call him, so I did it for you. You should be grateful." "No way." "That's right. It's your boss, Donald." When my father said that, Anthony was stunned. "Boss? What's going on? Is there some kind of problem?" My father's younger brother, Donald, the gang boss, appeared with a puzzled look. Other sturdy-built men accompanied Donald as if to protect him. They clearly had an atmosphere that was hard to call ordinary. "How have you been disciplining this guy named Anthony?" My father's voice, which I had never heard before, echoed in a low tone. The men surrounding Donald seemed to know my father too, as they were breaking out in a cold sweat. Donald glanced sideways at my father's angry face and stood right in front of Anthony. Donald, standing next to my father, was about the same tall height as him and had a similarly good physique. Surrounded by them, Anthony was trembling with his eyes wide open. "Did you tell this guy, Anthony, to collect protection money from me? When I borrowed this land from you, I properly paid the contract and money. Are you telling me to pay even more? You're the one who said you'd rent this place to me. Was it for this purpose?" Consulted by my father, Donald's eyes widened. He was silent, but it was clear he was saying there's no way he would do such a thing. Then Donald shot a sharp glance at Anthony. "I entrusted the house to my younger brother and became independent, but I haven't severed the brotherly bond with him yet. So there's no way my brother would order me to steal money from him. What's this all about?" Anthony listened to the two of them talk and was at a loss for words. "Charles, I'm changing the subject, but this man is not one of my subordinates. I've never even seen him before." Hearing those words, my father tilted his head. "He introduced himself as such, though? I heard there's someone who's been doing whatever he wants using my name lately. Maybe it's this guy." "Hey, what's the deal?" Donald asked, raising his eyebrows. That gesture was similar to my father's, and although the atmosphere was completely different, I could tell they were genuine brothers. "I see. Looks like you've been running wild as you please. If you're a gangster, there's a fitting punishment for that. You're prepared for it, right? Of course, since you were using my name without permission, you wouldn't do that if you weren't prepared, right?" Cornered by my father and Donald, Anthony trembled and sat down powerlessly. He continued to cower and began to apologize profusely. "I'm so sorry. I'm just a punk. I didn't mean to at all. But when I dropped your name, I got underlings and everyone around me started obeying, so I just..." Anthony finally confessed. He probably wanted to leave this place immediately. Anthony's underlings also apologized with all their might, claiming they had been deceived, but their claim didn't hold up. In a cold voice, as if it were a final warning, Donald declared to my father, "Charles, I'll take care of these guys." Hearing those words, Anthony looked up at Donald with trembling lips. Glaring sideways at him, Donald spoke to my father in a bitter tone. "This will never happen again. Let me say it again. How am I supposed to resolve this? Charles, I'm really sorry." Donald apologized without hesitation. His underlings also apologized to my father all at once, a large number of people. I felt unsettled at the unfamiliar sight. My father nodded in an accustomed manner and told Donald to stop apologizing. "I'm not a gangster, so I don't need to do anything more, but if you're going to apologize, could you lend me some of your underlings for a while for free? I'm short on workers, and I'd like to borrow hands other than my daughter. Anyone will do, at least at first. Is that enough for you?" "It's enough. But I'm asking you to give that guy, Anthony, some strict discipline. Thanks to him, our sales have dropped quite a bit." My father had a smile on his face, but his eyes weren't smiling. Anthony looked like he was about to faint. He must be imagining the misfortune that will befall him from now on and despairing. As if to add insult to injury, my father said in a low voice, "The ramen shop was my dream. But now that this has happened, I'm terribly sad. I know how passionate you are. So rest assured, I'll personally punish him." My father and Donald shook hands firmly. I was just watching my father and the others exchange from the side, but I felt very refreshed that they had somehow come to an agreement. In the midst of this, Anthony abandoned his companions to run away to save himself and ran toward the entrance, pushing those around him aside. But Donald's underlings blocked his way, and he was thrown back into the store. With nowhere to run, Anthony turned around and vigorously grabbed my shoulders as I stood there stunned.
Please! You're his daughter, right? Say something to him for me. I'm going to have a terrible time. There's a chance I might even lose my life. Please! Save me! You're the only one I can rely on here. I'll apologize for everything up until now, so please do something.
Hearing Anthony plead with such intensity, I involuntarily shrank back. But I pulled myself together and shook off his hand with a resolute attitude.
I think it was bound to come to this eventually. Also, I'll be charging you for the cost of the dishes you broke.
Hearing my words, Anthony hung his head powerlessly. When I declared that I would charge him including the cost of the food and drink, Donald burst out laughing.
She's a strong girl. As expected of Charles's child.
Hearing those words, my father had a slightly proud look on his face. A few days later, I saw an injured Anthony at the hospital my mother goes to. I inadvertently let out a sound and he noticed me too. I braced myself in case he might do something, but contrary to my feelings, when Anthony saw me, he started sweating profusely like a waterfall and cowering in fear.
Please let me go!
He apologized over and over. I stared at him in amazement, and the nurses who came running hurriedly separated me and Anthony. My mother, who had returned from the examination room, noticed the situation and came running, worrying about my safety. But since I knew the circumstances of how he ended up like that, I couldn't help but smile wryly. Actually, my mother doesn't know what happened that day. My father seems to have told my mother about his family home in detail, but he's keeping quiet about what happened at the store. The reason is my mother's tendency to worry. My mother has collapsed several times from worrying too much, so my father was probably worried about her health. Also, from what I heard from my father, it seems that as soon as Anthony's injuries heal, he'll be sent to work somewhere overseas. The money I demanded was paid in advance by Donald, and he said he'd introduce him to a job to pay back the borrowed money and that he'd never be able to return. While thinking it must be a terrifying place, I felt truly relieved that he wouldn't be able to do bad things again. After that, my father and I continue to run the ramen shop as usual. Donald's subordinates are also working energetically, and my father gives them their salary. Donald said he didn't need to do that, but since they're working cheerfully out of goodwill, my father probably can't help it. I agreed with my father. Even I receive some money under the guise of an allowance, so it's too much to not pay them. My father's store went through a lot, but gradually, customers started coming back. It's probably because my father's ramen was delicious. I also want to become a chef on par with my father and eventually aim to be the best in the world with ramen. I'm so into ramen now that I have such a dream.
I was brought here by my boss once.
That upscale steakhouse where we celebrated my birthday. There, I overheard something unexpected. The owner mentioned seeing my husband, David, with a young girl. We don't have a daughter. Just a while ago, David had said,
I came here with my boss from work.
Even though we were just talking about it. But who did David really come here with?
I heard you were here before with a young girl.
I questioned David, my tone a mix of dissatisfaction and suspicion. The moment he heard my words, David's face changed, turning my doubts into certainty. His expression reminded me of the one he had had when he tried to cover up a big mess in the past. We had promised never to lie again. But David looked away, evading my gaze. That was enough to betray my trust. I decided to seek help from some people and began preparing to teach David a lesson. I'm Betty, turning 41 this year. We live like an ordinary couple, but we've had our share of troubles. David and I have an important agreement. No lies or secrets. About 5 years ago, David secretly got into debt. What started as manageable spending for a hobby spiraled out of control, and he kept it from me until it became a huge amount. Even after being caught, David repeatedly lied, saying, "I have a way to pay it back, it's fine." But he ended up causing a major uproar involving our families before it settled. I wanted to handle it alone. I didn't want to involve you, Betty.
If that were true, you wouldn't have lied in the first place. It's not a lie. I never meant any harm. It just turned out this way.
His childish excuses and blatant lies infuriated me, and in return for helping him pay the debt. Never lie again. I made him promise. I thought we could start over if he truly repented. That's what I thought. I wanted to believe in David, who was a kind husband and helpful around the house. For the past 5 years, we had a peaceful life. But the promise was broken 5 years later. On my birthday, at a steakhouse. I felt uneasy about David's strange behavior in the luxurious restaurant. Nervously sitting at the counter, I contrasted with the relaxed David.
Happy birthday! I wanted to bring you here because the steak is great.
Really? Thanks. But how did you know about such an expensive place?
Oh, my boss brought me here once.
As we casually chatted, enjoying the owner's recommended steak. David, who seemed to like the place, ordered and ate more than me. Suddenly, David received a call.
Excuse me, a call from my boss. I'll be back.
Okay. It was unusual for David to get work calls on a day off. And lately, he spent more time on his phone. While I continued eating, the owner approached me. How's everything?
Delicious. I see why my husband likes it.
I'm glad. It's nice to have your family's patronage.
Family?
Yes. I saw your daughter last time. She's a beauty, just like Mom.
What?
His words stopped me mid-bite. We don't have a daughter. Who did David come here with? In response to the owner's unsettling story, I continued the conversation with a sense of skepticism. David had said, I came here with my boss from work. But the owner contradicted this, revealing that David had been there with a young woman. As I nodded along, more and more details emerged, deepening my suspicions about David. He seemed so close to her, like a father and daughter. It was memorable.
Really? What was she wearing?
She had light brown hair, like your wife, and bright eyes. Is she your daughter, in college now?
I don't have a daughter, though.
What? Pressing my forehead, I pondered the contradiction in David's story. His boss couldn't be a college-aged woman, and the owner had no reason to lie to me. Suddenly, the earlier call, supposedly from his workplace, seemed suspicious. As we stood there, puzzled, David returned.
I need to go to work. Something urgent came up.
Saying,
What about the bill? Can you cover it? You'll still eat, right? Really?
I was irritated. He brought me here for my birthday celebration, but now left without. Even reaching for his wallet, while I had barely started eating. Driven by my dissatisfaction, I confronted him with what the owner had told me. Who did you come here with before, David?
What? I told you, my boss.
The owner mentioned seeing you with a young girl.
What?
Seeing David's face change instantly, I was convinced of his deceit. His expression resembled the one he had when he tried to cover up a big fuss before.
That. I brought my brother's daughter here to celebrate her college admission.
I wish you had told me. I could have celebrated with her.
I think Betty was busy at that time.
Right. Sorry for doubting you.
It's okay. I have to go now.
Watching David hastily leave, I let out a sigh. If David was telling the truth, the owner should have known about Thomas and his wife too. But the owner didn't mention anyone else with David and the woman. And if it was really a celebration for his niece, Sarah, it created a significant inconsistency. Despite my reluctance, David's story seemed increasingly dubious. The owner was looking sorry and said, "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." But I shook my head. I couldn't believe David's story, feeling unsettled as I spent my birthday. Later, trusting my gut feeling, I decided to check with the Thomas couple. I called Thomas's mobile phone. Hoping this was just needless worry, I quietly listened to the ringtone. But my bad feeling was spot on, and I learned an unbelievable truth. Sadly, David going out with Sarah for steak is just not possible. So, David was lying after all. The more I tried to confirm, the clearer it became how pointless David's lies were. I was more disappointed that David told such an easily exposed lie than him meeting a young woman. He must have thought I wouldn't pursue and would just be deceived by his spur-of-the-moment lies. Feeling belittled by such childish lies, I sighed. Then, from Thomas's mobile phone.
Can I talk for a minute?
I heard a woman's voice. It was Thomas's wife, Barbara. Barbara, seeming more upset about David than me, spoke in a calm but angry voice.
Betty? It's Barbara. I heard what happened.
Barbara. I'm sorry to bother you over such a trivial matter.
That's all right. What are you planning to do now?
Her words sounded like,
How are you planning to get back at David?
It seemed like he was listening. I had consulted with the Thomas couple about David's debt issue before, so they knew the situation well. They were a strong support, more indignant about David's petty lying habit than I was. What to do? I guess, talk to him about his childish lies. I think that's too lenient. Do you think so? To my vague reply,
Yes.
Barbara exclaimed. She kindly encouraged me, disappointed in David's pathetic behavior.
You believed in him for a one-time mistake, right? And yet, he betrayed you again.
Yes, that's true.
David thought it was okay to lie and betray you again.
Ah, you're right.
Right? There's no reason to forgive him. Betty, it's okay to be angry.
Barbara's words made me realize. My disappointment in David's childish lies was one thing, but more so, he chose to deceive and betray me, thinking it was okay. Angered by David's self-preservation over our trust, I felt resentful.
Let's get Thomas involved and teach David a lesson.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Encouraged by Barbara and with their help, I started planning to discipline David. Since then, David has been awkwardly avoiding the topic of that steakhouse. He reacts excessively every time I bring something up, as if he desperately wants to avoid it. Though I was sick of David's seemingly theatrical attitude, I kept pretending not to notice until the counterattack Barbara had planned.
Hey David, Thomas and his family want to give us a souvenir from their trip. Why don't we go together?
To Thomas's place? I'm fine, you go alone.
What? It's no big deal. Aren't you eager to meet Sarah, especially after celebrating your college admission?
When I deliberately said that, David visibly became unsettled. It seems David is indeed scared of his lie being exposed. Thinking he should have been honest from the start, I scorned David in my mind while forcibly taking him to the Thomas couple's house. Even at their house, David looked anxious. While Barbara and I were chatting about the travel souvenirs in the living room, David nudged me.
Let's not bother them and head back soon.
And said. Seeking David's attitude, Barbara and I exchanged glances and smirked. It's no bother at all. Thomas will be back soon, so relax. Why not stay for dinner?
No, no. That would be imposing.
Oh, that reminds me.
I heard from David that Sarah got into college? Congratulations.
Yes, thanks. When I brought up Sarah, David grimaced for a moment and nudged me more frantically. Knowing what he was thinking, as my suspicions had turned to certainty, I could only give a wry smile.
By the way, David, I heard you treated Sarah to some fancy steak?
Well, that's, Betty told me and I was so surprised. Really, thank you. Barbara continued, and David visibly panicked. Despite his agitation, David responded to Barbara.
It's nothing.
He tried to go along with it without telling the truth. I didn't miss the malice in David's expression. Seeing David attempt to continue his lies with a flippant smile, Barbara narrowed her eyes. Sarah is picky. Isn't it hard to find something she likes?
No, not at all. She's a lovely girl.
Just as Barbara said, it seemed David intended to stick to his lie no matter what. If David insisted on lying, we had a plan to corner him where he couldn't escape. I had hoped David would be honest at some point, considering his past major blunder. But as David smiled and nodded along with Barbara, I looked at him with a cold gaze.
Yes, she enjoyed a variety. Salmon, shrimp. It was delicious, so you should try it too, Barbara.
Really? But I thought Sarah couldn't eat shrimp because of her allergy.
I was the one who ate the shrimp. It was really tasty, truly.
David continued to spin his tail, unaware he was dancing in Barbara's palm. He went on with his convenient lies, while Barbara pretended not to notice. David, who had looked so anxious to leave earlier, seemed to forget his unease and got carried away talking. Despite Barbara and me watching him with cold gazes, did he not realize? Unable to bear it any longer, Barbara decided to drop the bombshell. Thank you for celebrating even though it's not a prestigious college. By the way, David, do you remember which college Sarah got into?
Oh, what was it again? I've forgotten. Where was it?
Sarah's college is over 2 hours by bus from here. She started living alone.
Really,
David, finally realizing something from Barbara's words, fell silent. Without concern, Barbara pressed on with a forced smile. The last time she came home was for the New Year celebration.
What? What do you mean?
Sarah is a sophomore in college. She got in and moved last year. A belated celebration is quite surprising. When we talked about celebrating last year, David, you told me to handle it on my own. You don't remember that? At my words, David suddenly became very agitated. Realizing that his cheerful lies were transparent to us, he uttered a moan and his eyes darted around.
Why would you do this?
Why? We should be the ones asking that.
You spoke so smoothly, how did you manage that? You guys, how much do you know exactly?
You think there are still lies that haven't been exposed? You'd keep lying as long as they're not discovered? David looked at me with a pale face, apparently believing until now that his lies had worked, and I shook my head in disbelief. Just as Barbara said, there's no room for sympathy for David, who thought betraying and deceiving me was acceptable. With crossed arms and a sigh, I looked at David, who grimaced and glared at me.
So you knew and put on this act?
It's a fitting retribution for David, who thought it was fine as long as his lies weren't caught. I retorted bitterly to David's resentful words. He showed no signs of remorse, instead complaining about our revenge. Barbara could only smile unhappily at David's words. Then, Thomas arrived at just the right moment, entering the room with a smile.
Hey David. You treated Sarah to steak, right?
Thomas, actually.
I wanted to let her thank you in person, so I did some digging. Eh?
Interrupting David's attempt to confess, Thomas showed his mobile phone. On the screen was a photo of David happily walking with a young woman. Seeing it, David gasped and slapped the phone out of his hand. His reaction only confirmed my suspicions.
What's wrong, David? Something inconvenient in that picture? Stop it, all of you. Why are you doing this? Why? Don't you understand, David? Do you seriously think you've done nothing wrong?
Thomas glared at David, clearly irritated by his whining. According to Thomas's research, the woman David was seeing was indeed a college student, befriending David for his money. Thomas listed in detail how they met, the frequency of their meetings, and the gifts David gave. David held his head in his hands.
David, thinking it wouldn't reach Betty, you talked too much to your colleagues. Made it easy to find out everything. It's not like that. This is, If it's not, then show us your mobile phone. If you have nothing to hide, you can show it to Betty, right? I can't do that.
David, his face turning blue, started to make excuses like a child throwing a tantrum.
I can't show my phone, but I'm not lying. We're the bad ones for not believing, and it's terrible of us three to corner him.
Couldn't help but find it amusing, resting my chin on my hands and silently listening. As we silently watched, David eventually seemed to realize it was futile and just hung his head. After a long silence and repeated glances at us, I sighed yet again.
David, as soon as you thought it wasn't exposed, you kept piling lies upon lies to Barbara. It was truly unsightly. What the hell? You knew and still made me talk. Aren't you guys the bad ones?
Just when I thought he had quieted down, David defiantly got angry, and I no longer cared about getting an apology from him. I presented David with a piece of paper I hadn't intended to show. I stared intently at David. He seemed to remember the promise just then, freezing in shock.
Remember? That time, if you lied again, you'd return the money I used to pay off your debts. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I apologize for lying. Just please, not that.
I showed the written pledge from the debt incident. If he broke the promise not to lie, he'd have to return the money. If he couldn't do that, then divorce. Desperate to get help for his unmanageable debt, David had probably forgotten this inconvenient term.
This is why I couldn't tell the truth. Betty, you threatened me. Why would you do something that forces you to lie? That's,
No one was left to take David's side as he desperately tried to make excuses. David hung his head. I'm sorry. And finally muttered softly. Afterward, David kept, please, let's not get divorced, pleading with me. All his excuses about lying and ogling young girls didn't resonate with me. In the end, we settled on not getting divorced, provided that David gave me all his salary until he repaid the money I covered for him. Though it's a settlement, I can't trust David anymore, so it's more of a cold war until he repays everything. I'll really change and do better from now on.
Right. That's probably a lie too. After all, you're someone who can easily lie so blatantly.
Despite turning everyone against him, David kept lying without any remorse. The only thing I can expect from such a person now is to get my money back. I'm fed up with his childish lies, and my affection has cooled off. We barely talk now. David, trying to please me, started doing more housework. Smiling, he says, "I took out the trash." Or, "I did the cleaning." But there's no trust or anything left in him for me to be swayed. Without any disposable income, David can't go out anymore. He's probably just doing chores because he's bored, that's all I can think. Despite everything, being able to get along well with Barbara has been a silver lining in the clouds since then. Barbara often invites me out, and we've become close enough to go out together. She has been very caring towards me since the incident, which I appreciate. Being able to live with David, whom I can't trust, is also thanks to Barbara's support. "Betty, you're going out again?" "Yes, that's right." "You've been going out a lot lately." "I don't think so, but you're not cheating, are you?" I sneer at David's displeased look. I swallow the words, "Look who's talking," and smile sweetly. "Today, I'm going to have steak with Barbara. Would you like to come, David?" David stays silent and keeps his head down, continuing his cleaning. Knowing that upsetting me would only tighten the noose around his neck, David will likely continue to quietly do chores at home. The debt repayment will soon be finished, so I'm thinking of preparing the divorce papers shortly.
Mom's been in an accident and taken to the hospital. Please, can you drive me there?
I pleaded with my husband, tears streaming down my face. I had just received word that my mother was in a critical condition, unconscious after a traffic accident. However, upon hearing the situation, my husband responded, "I can't, I'm off to a company trip now," bluntly refusing my desperate request. Even as I persisted, he mocked me, saying, "The trip is more important to me. Visiting someone else's mother in the hospital is a waste of time. I'm definitely not going. My name is Jane. I'm 29 years old. My husband, Ben, who is a year older than me, and I got married 2 years ago, both of us working full-time. We met in the same university club. Although the club had many members and it was hard to talk to everyone, we ended up sitting next to each other at a drinking party one day, which led to us becoming close. We also discovered that we both were only children who grew up in single-mother households after losing our fathers early, which quickly brought us closer together. We started going out more and naturally progressed to dating. When we both became comfortable in our jobs as working adults, Ben proposed. Neither of us is currently thinking about children since we're both focused on our careers. However, we do want them eventually and have talked about buying a detached house when the time comes, shortly after getting married. Currently, we're renting an apartment and live close to both of our parents' homes. Since both our fathers have passed away, our mothers, Sarah and my mother-in-law Mary, live alone but have become very good friends. Their similar experiences of not remarrying and raising a child on their own seem to click. And since our family meeting, they've developed a friendship like no other, often meeting for tea or traveling together. I never expected them to get along so well, but seeing my mother happy with Mary makes me glad they met. Mary is also very fond of me, and we have a good relationship. However, Ben isn't too thrilled that Mary seems to prioritize my mother over him. He has quite the mama's boy trait. I knew from his behavior even before we got married how much he cherished his mother, which I understood, coming from a single-mother household myself. But shortly after we started living together post-marriage, I discovered his true nature. One holiday, I received a message from my mom with a photo attached, saying she was having lunch with Mary. Having lunch with Mary now? I read the message, accompanied by a photo of the two of them smiling, which naturally brought a smile to my face too. "Hey, Ben. Looks like Mary and my mom are having lunch. Look, she sent a photo, I said, showing the image to Ben, who was at home at the time. However, his mood soured immediately upon seeing it, and he clicked his tongue in annoyance.
What's this? Some kind of spite against me? Huh? What are you talking about?
At that time, I hadn't realized Ben disliked my mother. True, Ben often didn't talk much in front of my mother. But I thought it was because we were newly married and he was just nervous. I never imagined he would resent my mother simply because she got along well with his own.
Lately, every time I invite Mom out for a meal, she turns me down saying she has plans with Sarah. Doesn't your mother know the meaning of restraint?
I was shocked to hear Ben think this way and speak ill of my mother. Mary, too, seemed to have realized early on that Ben disliked my mother. There was a time when we were dining out as a group, and Ben made a snide remark towards my mother, which Mary couldn't stand and scolded him.
Ben, what is this attitude towards Sarah? Enough is enough. What? You always side with this person. Haven't you always said I'm your precious son? It's not funny preferring someone you've recently become close with over your own son.
Ben retorted, but I honestly found his attachment to Mary to be unnaturally strong. Later, when Ben wasn't around, Mary apologized to my mother and me. I think I've spoiled that boy too much. I'm truly sorry. There's no need for you to worry. I'm not bothered by it either. Ben really loves you. My mother, being gentle-natured and not prone to anger, seemed to accept the situation without blame. However, I could tell right away that she was hurt inside. And Ben, without considering my mother's feelings, progressively worsened his behavior over time. Although Mary would defend my mother, preventing Ben from openly attacking her, he would complain to me whenever my mother and Mary seemed close, eventually even starting to regularly speak ill of my mother. Not long into our second year of marriage, I couldn't take it anymore and had a huge argument with Ben. After a fierce exchange of words, the fundamental issues remained unresolved. And since then, our relationship has become awkward, with less conversation than before. Lately, I've noticed Ben's been coming home late and going out alone on weekends more often. Feeling something was off, I asked him directly. Work's been busy.
Lots of overtime and working on weekends lately,
he said. Despite his explanation, I couldn't shake off my feeling of unease. Then, one Sunday, when we both had the day off, I noticed Ben packing early in the morning. It seemed he wasn't going to work after all. Just as I was about to ask why he was packing, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Curious, I answered, only to find out it was the police. After confirming I was Sarah's daughter, the officer on the line dropped a bombshell.
Actually, Sarah has been involved in a traffic accident.
My mind went blank.
Mom!
She was already taken to the hospital, in a critical condition and unconscious. After getting the hospital's name, I managed to end the call with trembling hands. Tears started to overflow as I struggled to think, but knew I had to get to the hospital. However, I don't have a driver's license, so I desperately begged Ben for a ride.
Ben, something terrible has happened. Mom's been in an accident and taken to the hospital. Please, we need to go now.
But upon hearing the situation, Ben made a face of displeasure and said, "What?"
I'm about to leave for a company trip. I'll be late for the meetup. Deal with it yourself.
Flatly refusing my request.
A company trip? Today? You never mentioned anything.
I realized why he was packing, but I hadn't been informed about the trip at all. And to my shock, he mentioned the trip would last 2 weeks.
How can you think of going on a trip at a time like this?
Mom might.
Enough. The trip is more important to me. Your mother is just an unrelated stranger to me. Visiting someone I hate is a waste of time, and I'm definitely not going.
Ben hurled cruel words at me, scoffing. Get out of the way. I have a plane to catch and I'm busy. He pushed past me, whistling as he packed his clothes into a suitcase. Furious, I yelled,
You're the worst. Just do whatever you want.
And left the house, hurrying to the hospital by taxi. Ben went on his trip as planned, oblivious to the crisis unfolding around me. I tried calling him multiple times over the 2 weeks, but couldn't get through. When Ben returned home in high spirits 2 weeks later, I gave him a cold look. Now I have to give Mom her souvenirs. I wonder if Mom's doing okay, he said optimistically. Without responding, I quietly agreed to go with him to his mother's house. On the way, Ben happily talked about all the souvenirs he bought for Mary. Ben didn't say a word of concern about my mother, who had been in an accident. Upon arriving at his parents' house and trying to open the door, Ben stopped, puzzled.
Huh? Why is it locked?
It seemed unusual for the door to be locked, since Mary usually didn't lock it when she was home.
Is Mom not here?
Ben murmured. I pushed past Ben, pulled out the spare key I had for their house from my bag, and unlocked the door.
Hey! Why do you have the keys to the house?
Ben looked bewildered, but I didn't respond. Entering the house before me, Ben tilted his head in confusion upon not seeing Mary.
Doesn't something feel off?
As Ben moved towards the bedroom, I stopped him. Not that way. This way, I said, leading him to the living room, where a new portrait of the deceased Mary was displayed.
What?
Stunned, Ben began to tremble, and, half crying, rushed to the portrait, turning to me.
Hey! What's going on? What is this?
I sighed deeply, holding back my anger, and explained. Mary passed away while you were on your trip. The funeral's already over. Ben glared at me, furious.
Don't joke around. How can this be? Why does Mom have to die? Wasn't it your mother who was in the accident and in critical condition? If anyone was supposed to die, it should have been her. Despite Ben's outrageously insensitive outburst, I calmly explained what happened after my mother's accident. My mom woke up after the accident. She had a fracture and is currently undergoing rehabilitation but is gradually recovering. Though my mother was still hospitalized, she was slowly getting better thanks to the medical staff's efforts. But Ben was unsatisfied. Then why did Mom have to? He asked. It seems that on the day my mom had her accident, she was on her way to our house. She fell from a pedestrian bridge. And I hesitated before answering. I guess you had told Mary about going on a business trip, hadn't you? Yeah, I did mention it, but... Mary had been suspicious of you lately. You've been unreachable more often. She probably wanted to verify if you were really going on a business trip. I explained, and Ben looked shocked. According to Mary a month ago, Ben used to call or message her daily, but recently, communication had almost stopped. Mary had trouble reaching him by phone, and on the rare occasions he did call back, he would quickly say he was busy and hang up. Mary thought Ben, being of a certain age, might have naturally become less dependent on his mother. However, she suspected Ben might be hiding something. With her suspicions growing, Mary decided to check if the business trip story was true. Coincidentally, around the same time I received the call about my mother's accident. Mary, who passed away, had brought souvenirs from a day trip she took with my mother last month, intending to give them to us. That day, I was too distraught to think of anything but getting to the hospital.
so I didn't have the chance to inform Mary about my mother's accident. Mary must have taken the bus to the stop closest to our apartment and then walked the rest of the way. There's a pedestrian bridge on the way, and it seems she fell while climbing it. A witness said she missed a step just before reaching the top and tumbled down. Though an ambulance was called immediately, she had hit her head hard. And that's how Mary died. After explaining this to Ben, I glared at him intensely.
After learning about Mary, I called you numerous times.
Over these 2 weeks, no matter how I tried to contact you, you never answered your phone or replied to any messages. Because there were no other relatives to take on the role, I had to act as the chief mourner at Mary's funeral. With my mother still in a critical state, I had to somehow get through Mary's funeral without her real son.
You've been ignoring all contact for 2 weeks, just out having fun, right? This has shown me exactly who you are. I'm divorcing you.
Upon declaring this, Ben collapsed to the ground, crying loudly.
How can you say that right after Mom died? Now's not the time for divorce talk, is it? I didn't contact you because I was always with my coworkers. I had no time.
As Ben sobbed and made excuses, my anger only grew.
Stop lying!
I raised my voice and pulled out a piece of paper from my bag, thrusting it in front of Ben. It was the itinerary for the company trip I found in Ben's room.
It says here the company trip was from the 12th to the 19th for 1 week. But you were gone from the 5th to the 19th. You said just before leaving it was for 2 weeks, right? So what were you doing and where were you from the 5th to the 12th? Well, that's...
I know. You were cheating, weren't you?
And you spent that week with your affair partner, right?
As I spoke with certainty, Ben, who had stopped crying, began to panic.
What are you talking about? Cheating. I took leave for the remaining week to go on a trip with friends. See, work's been busy, and I needed a break.
Fed up with Ben's continued excuses, I pulled out a mobile phone from my pocket. The moment he saw it, his face turned pale. This mobile phone belonged to Ben, found in his closet while he was away on the trip. Likely, there was another mobile phone in his bag, prepared specifically for communicating with his affair partner. Ben had previously claimed he couldn't contact me while on his trip due to lack of time. But he had left his regular mobile phone at home, making it impossible for him to notice any calls. You've been lying through your teeth. You left this phone at home to spend time with your affair partner, didn't you? As I placed the mobile phone in front of Ben, he began to tremble and slammed his fist on the table.
Yeah, that's right. I've been fed up with you for a long time. I've got someone else I love now.
He shouted defiantly, and then,
And how did you know where to find the mobile phone? Don't tell me you searched my room while I was away.
He yelled, which was exasperating. I looked at Mary's portrait and silently apologized to her for showing such a scene before speaking up. Mary told me. At that, Ben choked on his words. After a big fight with Ben over my mother, he started coming home late and going out alone on his supposed workdays off more often. Suspecting something was off due to his increased unavailability, I had confided in Mary. Mary, sharing her suspicions about Ben, had advised me. Ben has had a habit since he was little of hiding things that are inconvenient for him, like bad test scores or a glass he broke that his father cherished. He's always securely hidden such things in the closet. If you find a bunch of towels there, it's likely he's hiding something among them. After Mary passed away, I remembered her words, checked Ben's closet, and sure enough, found the mobile phone.
I can't believe Mom would tell you such a thing.
Ben was visibly distressed, not having expected Mary to doubt him. However, seeing his dismayed state didn't sway me.
I will be seeking a divorce and compensation. I'm prepared to consult a lawyer and take this to court if necessary,
I stated firmly, conveying my resolve. Ben groaned but, realizing he had no way out, reluctantly agreed. Afterwards, we properly divided our assets, and the divorce was finalized. However, the following month, just as I was settling into my new life, I received a call from Ben. Reluctantly answering, I heard Ben plead.
Jane! Please, I need your help. What's the matter, exactly?
He explained he was in trouble at work after they found out about Mary's funeral. Since Mary had been listed as Ben's dependent, her death and the necessity of returning her insurance card to the company meant that her death was only then reported to the company, revealing that the funeral had taken place during the company trip. Ben was seen as a disrespectful son who didn't attend his own mother's funeral or even show up, garnering cold looks from his colleagues at work. Yet, Ben lied there too, shifting the blame by claiming I hadn't informed him about Mary's funeral. However, hastily sharing different stories with different people only made things worse. His inconsistencies and contradictions eventually unraveled, revealing his lies. Already viewed as inconsiderate, his repeated dishonesty led to doubts about his character, resulting in his isolation and eventual resignation to escape the situation. Now, without income, Ben is living off Mary's inheritance back at his parents' house. But the fact I didn't attend the funeral is known throughout neighborhood, making me feel ostracized. So, I thought about selling the house, but that's proving difficult. Ben is now recognized by the neighbors as the worst son, feeling awkward even just walking outside. He had planned to sell the family home quickly, but due to its age, there is a lack of interest from buyers. I'm really struggling right now. So Jane, let's start over. Remarry me and let's live together. Hearing this, I was disgusted. He was only reaching out because his situation had worsened.
Don't be ridiculous. I've had enough of you. I will never remarry you. Please. I can't go on like this. I don't care about you anymore. You should just live with your affair partner.
Rejecting him outright, Ben started to falter.
No, we've already broken up.
Apparently, the affair partner learned about Mary's funeral and, subsequently, that she was the other woman. Ben had hidden his marital status, leading to her anger and their breakup, leaving him alone. It's your fault. I don't want to be with someone like you. Goodbye. As I was about to hang up.
Wait! If you won't agree to remarry, I'll come to your house and argue in person. You're at your parents' place, right?
Ben threatened. But I'm not. I immediately responded.
Where are you then?
I won't tell you. Also, I've recently changed jobs, so lying in wait at my old company is useless. I've already asked everyone to call the police if you show up after my resignation. I decided to sell my parents' house to distance myself from Ben, despite the low likelihood of finding a buyer due to its age. So with my mother's consent, we sold the land after demolishing the house. My mother, having recently been discharged from the hospital, is deeply saddened by the loss of her close friend, Mary. Thus, we moved to a quiet place to live together, and I switched jobs accordingly.
Then at least tell me where you are. After all, I've received care from your mother, and I want to visit her.
Ben was desperate to find out where I was, but his words only infuriated me. And I was surprised by how cold my response was.
Received care? After you've been nothing but trouble for Mom. Don't start saying convenient things now. Besides, Mom has said she never wants to see you again. What? Wait a minute. Jane.
Ben was still trying to say something, but I mercilessly ended the call. I then blocked his number and changed mine a few days later. Later, I found out that Ben was being sued for compensation by the affair partner he deceived. And he was in a dire situation. Unable to borrow money due to lack of employment. He's been doing day labor and part-time jobs while searching for full-time work. My mother and I have started a new life in a new place. Relieved to have cut ties with Ben and reminiscing about Mary without stress. Mom couldn't attend Mary's funeral, nor has she been able to visit Mary's grave since her hospital stay and the move have kept us busy. It seems she hasn't fully accepted Mary's death, often crying while looking at photos and videos of them together.
I really want to visit Mary soon,
she said sadly, so I replied, yes, we should visit her grave soon. Planning to ensure we don't accidentally encounter Ben. I'm looking forward to making our new life in this new place fulfilling while supporting my mother. On the day we celebrated the 50th wedding anniversary of my in-laws, I arrived late and pulled along my son to introduce him to my sister-in-law, Abigail. This is my son, Mark. Mark, say hello.
I'm Mark, I'm 5 years old.
Mark clung to me and looked at Abigail, shyly greeting her.
Abigail, as I mentioned in my letter, my son has a congenital disability.
Before I could finish, Abigail blurted out.
EW, what a monster! Don't let it spread to my kids.
In that moment, both Mark and I froze as if time had stopped. Abigail's husband didn't say anything, but his look of discomfort was evident, clearly wanting to keep his distance. Kevin and the in-laws were speechless and rigid. I couldn't believe what was being said to such a young child, filled with disbelief. Not knowing what to say to the insensitive remarks of Abigail and her company. I stood there motionless until I heard a voice from beside me. Do people hate me again? Mark looked down, desperately trying to hold back tears. Such words would hurt an adult, let alone a child.
It's not contagious. He has albinism, which just means he was born with less pigment. It's still a disease, it can spread. Scarlett, get rid of that ugly kid fast. Get out.
My husband was trembling with anger. During the heated argument, tears fell from Mark's eyes. Interrupting Kevin, who seemed ready to confront Abigail, my father-in-law Robert spoke up.
Yes, don't ever come back.
The relief was visible on Abigail and her husband's faces. They smiled triumphantly as if they had found someone who understood them. But their smiles quickly turned to surprise.
What? Dad, what are you doing?
My name is Harper, a 40-year-old housewife living with my husband, Kevin, and our son, Mark. Only 5 years ago, the thought of living happily as a family of 3 was unimaginable. Kevin and I had always wanted children but were unable to conceive. I desperately wanted a child, and so did Kevin, which led us to seek fertility treatments at a hospital. There were days when it was hard to see pregnant women in the waiting room, reminding me that children are a gift. Despite careful diet and health management, I often wondered why I couldn't have a child, leading to days filled with self-loathing. The fertility treatments were not only emotionally taxing but also a financial burden, leading to many tearful nights. During those times, the person who was always there to support me was none other than Kevin. His encouragement, holding my hand, and accompanying me to the hospital were incredibly reassuring. It's okay, I'm sure our baby is just waiting for the right time to come to us. Miraculously, his words gave me hope, and I became more positive. The following year, our efforts paid off, and I became pregnant. We sharing the news with my in-laws Robert and Chloe, who were overjoyed. The baby grew healthy inside me, and we looked forward to the delivery day. On the day of birth, hearing the lively cries, I was deeply relieved and eagerly wished to see the baby's face. Yet, the child born had skin and hair so white and delicate, it seemed touching could break them, like an angel. Needless to say, Kevin and I were astonished. We were confused, as no one in our families had such an appearance.
Why?
The doctor explained our child had oculocutaneous albinism, a congenital condition known as albinism.
Albinism? The one that happens to 1 in 20,000 people.
It's a disease associated not just with physical appearance but also vision problems and sensitivity to sunlight. I regretted not being able to give birth to a normal child after fertility treatments. However, seeing the baby, all that faded away, and we embraced our child fully.
It doesn't matter if it's a rare disease. Our child is as beautiful and precious as an angel.
Exactly. This child chose us. Thank you, thank you. Thus, Kevin and I accepted our long-awaited baby positively and with hope. We named the child Mark and decided to raise him with love. Introducing him as our angel to the in-laws, they were initially surprised, but eventually warmed up to Mark's innocent smile.
It might be hard, but you two will surely overcome everything. If you ever need help, we're here for you.
The in-laws accepted and promised to love and care for him together. Mark's main concerns were managing sunlight exposure and weak vision. When going outside, sunscreen is essential, and Mark also needs assistive devices for his vision. However, now, thanks to the internet, connecting with friends who share the same concerns has lessened the feeling of struggling alone. There are several considerations in Mark's life, but otherwise, he's a healthy and mischievous boy. Kevin and I are delighted to see Mark increasingly doing things on his own. And before we knew it, 4-5 years had flown by. During this time, we visited the in-laws' house for Christmas, long weekends, and whenever the timing was right. The in-laws live about a 10-minute bus ride away, and from the station. Robert always picks us up in his car, mindful of Mark's condition. Thank you for always picking us up.
No problem. I always can't wait to see my grandson.
Once in the car, Mark always brightened up. Certainly, he liked cars, but there was a more pressing issue for him. The stares from others. When on the bus, some people would gawk or recoil at Mark's appearance, whispering or turning away. There were even times when people pointed their phone cameras at him, leading us to ask them to stop and shielding Mark from their view. Such actions deeply saddened me as a mother and sometimes made me angry, wondering why they would do such things. Affected by these stares, Mark would shrink into himself on the bus. Especially since turning 5, he would hide behind me or Kevin, or cling to Robert and Chloe, curling up small. Thinking how hard it must be for Mark himself tightened my chest with pain. One night, before bed, Mark asked, "Mom, Dad, am I weird? Does everyone dislike me? Why would you think that?" I replied, "Because, in the train, everyone looks at me so much." Hearing Mark express his feelings was heart-wrenching, and I've never felt more distressed. Kevin seemed troubled too, his brows slightly furrowed. I pulled Mark close, looked him in the eyes, and assured him, "You're not weird, and nobody dislikes you. Even if people look, you can hold your head high." With tears welling up in his eyes, he listened to my words and simply replied, "Okay, I understand. Mark, how about you sleep with Dad tonight?"
Okay. Read me a story?
Excited, Kevin headed to the bedroom with Mark. Watching them, I stayed in the living room, sighing.
The 50th anniversary celebration for Robert and Chloe is coming up, and I'm a bit worried.
At kindergarten, there are teachers to support and friends who are told about Mark's condition, which offers some comfort, but public places are a different story. struggling with this challenge. Mark, Kevin, and I were all searching for solutions, discussing with friends as well. Recently, Kevin brought up the 50th wedding anniversary celebration of the in-laws. Abigail, my sister-in-law living far away, would be coming, and it was suggested we celebrate grandly with her family.
Mark hasn't met Abigail yet. It might be a good opportunity, don't you think, Scarlett? Abigail too?
Truthfully, I didn't have the best impression of Abigail, my sister-in-law. Her family moves often due to her husband's job, and I've only met them once or twice. When Mark was born, I sent a letter but received no reply. Worried they didn't care about our family, I felt anxious about introducing Mark. When I shared my concerns, Kevin reassured me with a smile, "It'll be okay."
Abigail isn't that bad, and her husband has always been nice to me. Okay.
I conceded, perhaps overly concerned about others' judgments. Maybe Abigail and her husband are genuinely kind, and the lack of response to my letter was just due to their circumstances. If they're coming all this way to celebrate their parents' 50th anniversary, we shouldn't dismiss their intent. While I could handle any comments about me, I worried whether Mark would be accepted or subjected to stares like on the bus. But we agreed to include Abigail's family. And so, with lingering anxiety, we approached the day of the 50th anniversary celebration. Due to flight schedules, Abigail's family would arrive later. For this special day, instead of Robert's car, Kevin and I escorted the in-laws to a high-end restaurant. Because we had a reservation, I said, "I'm Harper," and the receptionist led us to our room. Robert and Chloe, smiling happily, held Mark's hand as they walked to their seats. The stylish space, fitting about 10 people, was lit with soft lighting, creating a calm atmosphere. Grandpa and Grandma are happy. I'm happy too. Yes, Mark is happy too. Mark seemed to understand today was special, smiling more than usual. He was dressed in new clothes bought for the occasion, looking even cuter, which made the staff lady smile. After some time chatting, Abigail's family arrived late. They appeared in formal attire, and Scarlett, Mark's cousin, was also dressed in a cute outfit. "Sorry we're late." "Dad, Mom, congratulations today." Abigail dropped her bag and greeted Robert and Chloe. Of course, Abigail's husband and Scarlett smiled and said, "Congratulations." When they settled, I nervously greeted Abigail's family. Abigail, long time no see. Thank you for coming all this way today." "Ah, right." However, she responded indifferently, as if she barely knew me. Gathering my courage, I brought Mark over to introduce him.
This is my son, Mark. Say hello, Mark. I'm Mark, 5 years old."
Mark clung to me and shyly greeted Abigail.
"Abigail, as I mentioned in my letter, my son has a congenital disability."
Before I could finish, Abigail bluntly said,
"EW, what a monster. Don't let it spread to us."
Instantly, Mark and I froze as if time had stopped. Abigail's husband, without saying a word, clearly looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting to keep his distance. Kevin and the in-laws were speechless and stiff. I was filled with disbelief at what was said to such a young child. Not knowing what to say to the inconsiderate Abigail, I stood there motionless, but then I was brought back to reality by a voice from beside me. "Do people hate me again?" Mark looked anxious, holding my hand. Laughing, Abigail said,
"Yeah, nobody wants to see your face."
Mark looked down, trying hard not to cry. Such words would hurt an adult, let alone a child. I thought about slapping Abigail right there, but hugged Mark tightly instead.
"What are you saying, Abigail? That's not true." "That's right." "Abigail, how could you say that?"
Chloe hugged me and Mark in defense.
"EW, what?" Mom, you're defending that monster? It's gross, like, it's all white and has white hair. Is it contagious? Get it away if it's going to spread. It's not contagious. It doesn't spread. He has albinism, a condition of being born with less pigment. So, it is a disease. It could spread. Why did you bring him? Stay away. Scarlett, stay back. Abigail, don't say that. Mark is not a monster, nor is it contagious. Don't treat him like that. Kevin, is that really your child? Unbelievable. Why can't you be more considerate, Abigail? Just get rid of that ugly kid, fast. Get out.
Kevin's hands trembled with anger. During the heated argument, tears streamed down Mark's face. Intervening before Kevin could confront Abigail, Robert spoke up.
Yes, don't ever come back.
Only Abigail and her husband were relieved by those words. Their faces wore a triumphant look, as if to say they have found an ally. But that smile quickly vanished, turning into a look of surprise.
What? Dad, what are you doing?
Robert had grabbed Abigail and her husband's bags and threw them out of the room. Then, after clapping his hands together, he turned back to the astonished couple.
To treat a polite child who greeted you upon meeting for the first time, like this. That's not my daughter. You are the monsters. I don't want to see such ugly faces. But Dad, what if you and Mom catch it? I'm worried. No need to worry. If you had the heart to worry about me, you could have considered Mark's feelings too. Why didn't you? No, come on, that's just not normal, no matter how you look at it. Stop saying such heartless things. Get out now.
Abigail's couple was taken aback by Robert's demeanor, unseen by Kevin and me before. They seemed to want to say something more, but then a voice exclaimed, "Stop it." All eyes, including Kevin's, turned to the source. Surprisingly, it was Scarlett, dressed in her cute outfit. Her cheeks flushed.
Albinism isn't contagious, and he's not a monster. Why would you say that? Dad and Mom, that's awful.
She declared this with all her might, tears streaming down her face. That alone showed she was angry and hurt for Mark, which made me incredibly happy. Yet, Abigail harshly responded to her daughter.
Scarlett, be quiet. You don't know anything. You're the one who doesn't know anything, Mom. I'm so embarrassed right now. Hating Mark without even trying to understand him. I hate you too.
Scarlett's almost shouting voice turned Abigail and her husband pale. Undeterred, Scarlett ran to Mark, towering slightly like an older sister, and gently stroked his head. Don't cry. You should smile. You're not a monster, and you're not disliked. The people who say that are wrong. Okay. Both Scarlett and Mark's faces were smeared with tears and runny noses. It was difficult to get Abigail and her husband to understand Mark, but Scarlett was different, which was reassuring. Seeing Scarlett approach Mark and pat his head, Abigail seemed to snap out of it, hastily leaving with her husband without a word. The commotion drew the attention of other patrons outside, likely making Abigail's family feel unwelcome. While some staff members asked patrons to return to their seats, we resumed our conversation as if nothing had happened. The rest of the meal went smoothly, without tears or derogatory words, marking a peaceful time. After the 50th wedding anniversary celebration ended, and we returned to our usual lives, I was struck by a question. How did Scarlett know about albinism?
Kevin, did you talk to her on the phone? No, I haven't. I thought you had told her, Harper.
Wondering how she knew about Mark without us telling her, we received a letter. The sender was Scarlett, who had apparently gotten our address from Robert and Chloe. The letter, written on cute heart pattern stationery like that of a young girl, contained her earnest words. After dinner that day, we decided to read the letter together. The letter began with "To Mark's mom and dad," sharing Scarlett's personal thoughts on people with albinism. Scarlett, due to her parents' moves, had changed schools several times, about 3 in total. At one of her previous schools, there was a child with albinism similar to Mark. This child had white hair and wore special glasses for poor vision. But after the teacher's explanation, all classmates respected and treated the child well. And Scarlett liked that child. Without discrimination against anyone, not minding their own disability. And being kind to everyone, she found them genuinely cool and fell for them. Even with poor eyesight, they had great hearing, were good at singing, and could play the piano. I wanted to be as kind as them, but Mom was different. On a day when parents gathered, seeing the albino child with Scarlett, Abigail frowned immediately.
"Scarlett, who's that child? Dyeing hair in elementary school? And those ugly glasses don't suit at all. You shouldn't play with that child, okay? Understand?"
Saying so, she complained. Scarlett was filled with disbelief and felt very upset. Shocked and frustrated at her inability to retort her mother's heartless words. So, I felt relieved when I could finally speak up about Mark. Reading the letter made me feel warm, realizing Scarlett had been harboring those feelings during the 50th wedding anniversary celebration. Later, Scarlett settled in her current school and, driven by a desire to be understood, read an essay on albino awareness during an open class.
"My parents labeled my cousin a monster without trying to understand albinism. I think those who say such things have monstrous hearts."
I hope more people understand albinism and refrain from saying terrible things like my parents did. I wish for a class where everyone respects each other as they did at my previous school. The composition she read on open day, advocating for mutual respect, was highly praised. At the same time, Abigail and her husband faced condemning stares and were embarrassed. Following that open day, they were viewed coldly by other parents in the neighborhood, and Scarlett was scolded by Abigail. But she seemed unfazed, hoping to grow up to be someone who can eloquently explain and support people with albinism. "Please be kind and stand tall, Mark. I'll do my best too. See you." The letter ended with this message, accompanied by a cartoon character sticker that seemed like it could come from a girl's magazine, saying "Your ally." Of course, Mark still can't read well, nor does he fully understand the meaning of the words. But when I carefully explained how to read it, Mark, with a happy smile, excitedly shouted, "Ally, ally." Seeing this made both Kevin and I happy, and we all ended up laughing together. In fact, since the day of the 50th wedding anniversary celebration, Mark, perhaps remembering Scarlett's words, has always stood tall, never shrinking, whether on the bus or at kindergarten. What kind of mental change occurred, I'm not sure, but it seems Mark has understood Scarlett's words in his own way. When going to meet the in-laws, as usual, we got on the bus and sat down. Some high school girls who seemed to have finished school early were talking about Mark, covering their mouths but their eyes laughing. "What's that? White hair?" I was considering changing seats, but then I noticed Mark had also seen the girls and was staring back at them. "Mark?" When I called out to him, Mark, still looking at the high school girls, smiled back at them. Surprised, perhaps, the girls moved away, flustered. There were other times when we were talked about or stared at, but Mark began to smile back each time. The speakers would feel guilty, stopping their gossip and diverting their attention to their phones. It seems to be Mark's own way of handling situations, though I wondered where he learned such diplomacy. But upon reflection, Scarlett had encouraged him that day, "Don't cry, just smile." Those words must have resonated with Mark. It's not that there are no more people who mock or stare or demean based on appearance. In fact, we'll likely encounter more such people. Seeing Mark not just protected by me, his mom, but protecting himself, made me feel incredibly proud of his growth. Our child is striving to live with strength.
Maybe it's thanks to Scarlett.
I often think, if only there were more kind-hearted children like Scarlett. Discussing this with friends, I found support among other moms, leading to small educational gatherings in public spaces. If both those directly involved and those around them can understand each other, surely we can connect kind-hearted people and create a slightly kinder world than today. I hope for a world where more people, like Scarlett, understand and treat those with disabilities without discrimination, making it a better place for Mark to live positively. Finally, my sister Whitney has given birth. Our family was overjoyed, and even though it wasn't Christmas, relatives gathered together. The stars of the show were, of course, Whitney and her baby. With food and drinks ready, the party began. After we all toasted, my husband Brad approached Whitney and the baby. Whitney handed the baby to Brad, and he held the baby in his arms. Brad looked at the baby with such a loving gaze, as if he were holding his own child.
"Hello, baby. Oh, you're so cute."
After admiring the baby, he turned to me and said, "If only you could actually have kids." Followed by a sigh.
"Still really cute. Wonder who it looks like."
He insulted me in front of all the relatives, seemingly unaware of the icy atmosphere that followed. In the frozen silence, the family gathered around Brad and Whitney, enclosing them. Whitney and Brad, engrossed with the baby, hadn't noticed until Whitney's husband Chuck spoke up.
"It really doesn't seem to take after me. There are elements of Whitney, though."
He confronted Brad calmly. It seemed Whitney and Brad finally noticed the awkward air. Surrounded by relatives, they looked to be huddling together. "Overall, Brad, it seems to take after you, don't you think?" Donald, Brad's dad, added insult to injury.
"Really now? Brad, it's the spitting image of you when you were little."
His tone was cold, unfitting for the celebration.
Eh?
Seeing Brad taken aback, I couldn't help but let out a smile. Brad had no idea that I had been laying the groundwork with the relatives. I'm Zoe, 42 years old. My life has been nothing extraordinary. Not academically gifted, nor athletically talented. Not the type to stand out, I've probably been forgotten by my classmates, leading a plain life. I have a younger sister, Whitney. Unlike me, Whitney is beautiful and stylish. Though our age difference spared me from blatant comparisons, from what I saw, Whitney was adored by many from a young age. Becoming a show-off in elementary school worked to her advantage, making her a central figure in her class. People gravitated towards her, regardless of gender, and after school, friends were always coming over. As she grew older, perhaps thinking little of my plainness, Whitney would say, "Zoe, you're so plain. Make sure not to show your face when my friends are over." Ignoring me even when her friends weren't around. Confused by Whitney's attitude and feeling uneasy around my own sister, I decided to move out. I had a job lined up and had saved some money from working part-time while attending college. So I moved out without anyone stopping me. It was lonely at times, but being alone was more comfortable than being nagged by Whitney. Occasionally, when I visited home, I heard from Mom that Whitney's behavior seemed to be getting worse year by year. By the time she was in high school, Whitney started going after people's boyfriends. And Mom would come to me for advice. But since I had no experience with love, all I could do was try to console Mom. In the end, Whitney never changed, and Mom's worries never ceased. I became close to a senior coworker while working together on a project. His name was Brad. He was 2 years older than me, someone I had been on the same team with since the last project. I had never been approached by men before, but after the project ended and we all went out for drinks, he asked for my contact information. Even while drinking, I was the sober one, taking care of drunk colleagues and supporting the organizer, which apparently caught his attention.
How about we go out for dinner, just the two of us?
Thinking he had asked for my contact for work-related reasons, I was surprised by his sudden invitation. Finding no reason to decline and thinking this would be a one-time thing, I accepted his invitation. However, when we actually sat down to eat and talk, we got along so well that time flew by. Unable to suppress the feeling that I didn't want it to end with just this once, I found myself saying, "May I have the pleasure of inviting you out next time," in a surprising move. Perhaps it was the alcohol talking. I was flustered after saying those words. Brad looked stunned. "Oh no."
I didn't mean that. I'm sorry. I meant for work advice, not that. I didn't have any ulterior motive."
I rushed to explain, wanting to run away from the embarrassment. Then, ulterior motive. "You're an interesting person, Zoe." Brad burst out laughing.
I'd be happier if it was with ulterior motives.
Suddenly serious, Brad took my arm. "Shall we go to another place?" I quietly nodded and followed Brad. I'll never forget that night. Even after we got married, we would laugh about it when recalling that time. My first love at 28 felt embarrassing, but he accepted me and took the lead. With him, my once plain life seemed to blossom into something beautiful. At 28, I finally understood what love was, and I gained confidence. 2 years later, he proposed, and we got married. Me, Zoe, 30 years old. Married at a nice round age. And with a new name, I decided to start a new life. I got along well with Brad's parents, especially Mael, as if we were friends. The common mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflict was non-existent for us. Whitney, attending our wedding, seemed enraptured by the atmosphere, barely acknowledging me. After the ceremony, as Brad and I were heading to the next venue, Whitney ran up to us.
"Zoe, today's wedding was so beautiful. It makes me want to get married soon too."
Any past resentment seemed gone. Whitney smiled at me.
"It's about time I settled down too. Not just any man will do. I'll find the right one and have a wedding that everyone can celebrate."
It seemed our wedding made her crave a normal happiness. Declaring her intention to change, Whitney left. I was stunned by our brief exchange, but wanted to believe in her words of change. If my image had cast a positive light on Whitney, then I was satisfied. Feeling that years of resentment had dissipated made me genuinely happy. I looked forward to having face-to-face conversations in the future. Since my marriage, Mom's worries shifted from Whitney to me. Yes, about children. Getting married at 30, I understood my parents' eagerness to see grandchildren. Of course, I wanted children too. I was working but planned to quit if I had a child. Initially, I hadn't thought deeply about it, but as time went on, I grew tired of Mom's constant nudging. Wanting to respond to my parents' feelings, I began to excessively consult with Brad. Initially, Brad took it lightly, saying, "Don't rush, it'll happen when it's meant to." However, as I repeatedly brought up the same concerns,
"Come on, I'm tired today. Let's not talk about this anymore,"
he started to visibly show his annoyance. 5 years into our marriage, we hadn't had children, and by that time, Brad seemed to have given up. I was 35 before I knew it. Nowadays, It's not uncommon for people older than me to have children. But I knew I was reaching the age where I had to prepare myself. I knew that if we truly wanted children, we would have to undergo the appropriate tests and treatments. And I was aware of how difficult that could be. Brad was saying, even without children, we have the option to enjoy life together. But I couldn't give up. Should we try getting tested, just once? Holding on to a last hope, I asked Brad. Brad was reluctant but agreed to go to the hospital. Perhaps thinking that if a problem was identified with either of us, I would give up. However, Brad's attitude became colder after we went for the tests. When we went back to the hospital to get the results, I understood why Brad was being cold. The issue with not being able to have children was on Brad's side. Unable to accept the test results, perhaps because of his pride. Brad started to take out his frustration on me. Unable to maintain a happy relationship, all I could do was wait for him to calm down. 3 years later, Brad's demeanor had improved compared to back then. But he still came home late or not at all sometimes. By that time, Whitney had finally found someone to marry. It had been 8 years since our wedding, and it seemed she had struggled a lot during that time. Her habit of playing around since her younger days was hard to break. And even when she found someone good, she would quickly lose interest, so relationships didn't last. However, the man Whitney found this time was broad-minded enough to accept all of her past actions. Moreover, we learned at their wedding that Whitney's husband was an elite businessman working for a major trading company. How they met and got to the point of marriage was unclear, but seeing Whitney happy reminded me of my own early marriage days. I hadn't imagined things turning out this way back then. Still, I believed that marrying Brad was my happiness. Even without children, we could still make it as a couple. Watching Whitney in her wedding dress, I reaffirmed my love for Brad in my heart. Realizing that children were not in the cards for Brad and me, Mom shifted her hopes to Whitney. Honestly, I was relieved to no longer be pressured by Mom. Whitney was still in her 20s and likely to meet Mom's expectations. Somewhere inside, I too had hopes for Whitney. 3 years later, the grandchild Mom had been longing for was finally on its way, growing inside Whitney. Mom cried and thanked Whitney when she found out. Hearing this news, I felt like my worries were finally over. It had been such a long journey to this day. My relationship with Brad wasn't great, but I hoped this could be a turning point. We hadn't spoken much lately. Whenever he did open his mouth, it was only to make snide remarks, but Brad's attitude seemed to change when he learned about Whitney's pregnancy. Perhaps he felt guilty towards my mom for us not being able to have children. As Whitney's belly grew, conversations with Brad increased. Whitney's due date was drawing close. At home, the anticipation for the first grandchild made Dad and Mom restless. And then, Whitney finally gave birth. Our family was overjoyed, and relatives gathered together even though it wasn't Christmas. Attending Whitney's baby shower were Brad and me. Brad's parents, Whitney and my dad and mom, and Whitney's husband Chuck and his parents. It was the first time so many relatives had gathered together. The stars of the show were, of course, Whitney and her baby. I was busy in the kitchen preparing the food and drinks. With everything ready, the party started. After we all toasted, Brad approached Whitney and the baby. Whitney handed the baby to Brad, and he held the baby in his arms. Normally, showing a baby to relatives would be a common sight, but something felt off. Brad looked at the baby with such a loving gaze, as if he were holding his own child. The affection he showed towards his wife's sister's child seemed a bit too intense. Without caring about that, Brad held the baby and murmured,
"Hello, baby. Aw, you're so cute."
After showering the baby with love, he turned to me and bitterly said, "If only you could actually have kids." Followed by a sigh.
Still really cute. Wonder who it looks like.
He insulted me in front of all the relatives, seemingly unaware of the icy atmosphere that followed. In the frozen silence, my dad, Brad's parents, Chuck, and his parents gathered around Brad and Whitney, enclosing them. Whitney and Brad, engrossed with the baby, hadn't noticed until Chuck finally spoke up.
Really, it doesn't seem to take after me. It seems to have few similarities with Whitney too.
He calmly confronted Brad. It seemed Whitney and Brad finally noticed the awkward air. Surrounded by relatives, they appeared to be huddling together.
Overall, Brad, it seems to take after you, don't you think?
Brad's dad added to the tension, saying,
Indeed. Brad, it's the spitting image of you when you were little.
His voice was cold, inappropriate for the celebration. Seeing Brad taken aback, I couldn't help but smile. Brad was unaware that I had been laying the groundwork with the relatives. Months ago, I happened to see Brad's mobile phone. That day, I had taken the morning off to go to the hospital and found Brad's phone left on the dining table. Thinking to deliver it to him at work later, I was about to put it in my bag when the phone vibrated. Curiosity led me to glance at the screen, displaying a message from Whitney.
Your baby is growing bigger.
My blood ran cold. Next, I was seething with anger. Whitney was trying to steal Brad. Given Whitney's past behavior, there was no doubt in my mind. To confirm, I looked at the message exchange between Whitney and Brad. It was an affair. Whitney planned to pass Brad's child as Chuck's. Brad was waiting for the right time to divorce me and remarry Whitney. I took photos of the message exchange as evidence. Since then, I've acted oblivious. Brad's parents believed me immediately due to our close relationship. They also felt sorry for their son's actions. I approached Chuck about it once before Whitney gave birth. He seemed to have had suspicions about Whitney's pregnancy. Showing him the evidence, he agreed to my plan. And so, we've come to this moment. Brad, caught off guard, while Whitney smiled brightly.
Stop it, everyone, that's such a bad joke,
she said, feigning innocence.
Would you stop your bad jokes?
The voice trembled with anger. I felt sorry for asking everyone to play along until now. And Whitney seemed to finally sense the deep loathing in his angry voice. Whitney's complexion changed. Noticing this, Brad stepped in to defend her. Hey, Whitney's just tired from giving birth. No need to speak like that. I confronted Brad, fueled by the future he planned for his mistress. I see you can be kind for the sake of your future wife. I showed him the screen of his mobile phone. The photo of the message exchange with Whitney. Brad, shocked then glaring, yelled,
What the hell is this?
He stood up, grabbing me by the collar.
When did you start doing such dirty things?
He didn't even try to make excuses. It would have been better if he had tried to explain it was all a misunderstanding. When he raised his fist at me, Chuck intervened.
Stop raising your hand to a woman.
The grip Chuck had on Brad's arm was forceful. Brad shook off his hand and retorted in frustration.
Saying that. Aren't you two the ones in a shady relationship?
Retreating while rubbing his grabbed arm. Whitney, seizing the moment, jumped into the fray.
Yeah. Instead of doubting Brad and me, you should be looking into these too.
However, it seemed like no one was listening to her. The silence was broken by me and Whitney's dad. Enough, Whitney. Dad had always been a man of few words. He was gentle and, according to Mom, sometimes too soft, never getting angry at Whitney's misbehavior. But this time, he couldn't stay silent. It's your bad habit, isn't it? I thought you had changed after getting married, but stealing your sister's husband. Dad spoke quietly but with a voice as cold as ice to Whitney. I should have scolded you more. I didn't want you to see me like this. After giving me a sorrowful look, Dad slapped Whitney's cheek hard.
Ouch!
Looking down at Whitney holding her cheek, he sighed and then turned to Brad.
No, Donald. It's not like that. This is all a misunderstanding.
Brad finally tried to defend himself just as Dad's fist hit him. Brad crumpled to the ground. Then, Dad loudly said to them,
The pain you're feeling is nothing compared to what Zoe and Chuck went through. Do you understand?
Whitney's sobbing could be heard, though it was doubtful if her tears were from remorse. Dad turned to Chuck and his parents to apologize deeply. I'm truly sorry for the unforgivable act my daughter has committed. Mom also apologized next to Dad. Then to Brad's parents, I'm sorry for raising my hand to Brad in front of you, apologizing deeply once again. Brad's parents also apologized to us.
What is this? I did nothing wrong.
Brad began to shout, breaking the silence.
It's all because Zoe is infertile.
What a pitiful sight.
So, it's not my fault.
Whitney also started to struggle.
It's Zoe's fault. Having such a wonderful husband but not being able to bear children. So I decided to have his child instead.
Whitney seemed to realize midway. No one was on their side. Cold stares were fixed on them. I decided to make it clear. Listen, Whitney. I struggled to keep my anger from seeping into my gentle tone. The cause of infertility wasn't me.
Wah!
Whitney was stunned. We had fertility tests done. Everyone listened silently to my voice. The results showed that Brad was the cause. The room went quiet.
Wah! No, that.
Whitney's eyes began to dart around. A habit when she's hiding something.
Brad? That's a lie, right?
Whitney confronted Brad, but he was deflated.
I don't accept those test results.
Brad couldn't accept that he was the one unable to have children, but I showed the hospital's test result papers. Dad and Mom looked at the evidence, and from Whitney's reaction, it seemed they realized something.
Whitney, whose child is that baby really?
Delivering the final blow.
It's Chuck's child, obviously.
She seemed unaware that her story was changing by the moment.
Then, to put Chuck's mind at ease, why not do a DNA test?
Whitney's eyes darted around nervously.
There's no need for that. It's Chuck's child.
Mom approached Whitney, speaking to her with the gentleness one uses with a small child. Whitney, let's get tested, shall we? I want to believe you, Whitney. Let me believe you this time. Her voice trembled towards the end. Mom was sobbing, huddled over.
You're old enough, Whitney. It's time to take responsibility.
Dad told Whitney, then apologized again to everyone gathered. He promised to report the results later, and Whitney's baby celebration party came to an end. Whitney stubbornly refused the DNA test, but her attitude only spurred our parents more. Dad tried to persuade Whitney himself, but she wasn't willing to listen. Eventually, without Whitney's consent, the test was forcibly conducted. Meanwhile, I had moved out of the house I shared with Brad. Brad, still not accepting his infertility, joked, "So, Whitney will move in after you leave." But I was already starting the divorce proceedings, undistracted. Months after the family gathering, Mom contacted me about Whitney's DNA test results. We were to return to our parents' house to hear the outcome. Brad, Chuck, and I listened intently to the results, which were unexpected by all. A heavy sigh escaped everyone's lips. The father of Whitney's child was neither Chuck nor Brad.
What on earth does this mean?
Dad couldn't contain his anger. Even more furious than when he had slapped Whitney.
What does this mean, you say?
Whitney asked rhetorically, but no one supported her.
Whitney, explain yourself.
Chuck admonished her in a low voice. Resigned, perhaps realizing she couldn't escape the truth any longer, Whitney explained in a small voice.
I don't know who the father is. Chuck was so busy with work right after we got married, and I felt so lonely.
Her voice gradually turned whiny.
It's not my fault Chuck made me feel lonely, right? The child is innocent. Let's pretend that night never happened. Please.
Whitney moved closer to Chuck, not Brad.
So, what about you and Brad?
Chuck asked gently.
Right. Brad was just for fun. I was entertaining him because things weren't going well with Zoe.
Whitney glanced at Brad and laughed. Besides, Brad may come from a wealthy family, but he's so stingy. He never spoiled me. Chuck, you're the only one for me. Whitney clung to Chuck's arm. Brad, faced with the realization of his infertility and Whitney's abandonment, was just staring blankly. So it is. Chuck muttered softly, then forcefully shook off Whitney's clinging arm. Whitney fell off the couch, but Chuck stood up, towering over her. I've had enough. Talking to you any further is a waste of time. His eyes filled with hatred and sorrow. Dad and Mom said, we'll send the divorce papers later. Thank you for everything up to now. Without giving Whitney another look, Chuck left the house. It's the expected outcome, Mom said, placing a hand on Whitney's shoulder.
From now on, you're nothing to me. Leave this house immediately.
Mom had always ultimately accepted Whitney despite her behavior. But this time it seemed she had reached her limit. I've been too lenient. But don't worry, I won't bother with you anymore. Live strong on your own. We had never seen Mom react so coldly before. But her resolve seemed firm, as if she had come to a clear decision. Dad agreed with her decision, and it was decided that Whitney would be kicked out of the house. So, how long do you plan to stay here? I asked Brad, who was left behind. Brad slowly looked up at me. Then, as if realizing something too late, he asked, Zoe, that kid wasn't mine, right?
If so, I'm innocent. Whitney was just playing around, as she said. So, why don't we call off the divorce and start over?
I was speechless. After all the mocking, he had the nerve to say that.
I have no intention of starting over with you. I wish I never have to see you again. So please, leave this house right now.
I grabbed a mop nearby and hit Brad with it.
Get out now!
I shouted as I chased him out. Later, I finalized the divorce with Brad. I had gotten along well with Mil and wanted to keep in touch, but it wasn't to be. Mil and I had a farewell meal together, mourning our separation. Upon learning of my divorce with Brad, Whitney, who had been hesitant, agreed to divorce Chuck and finally left the family home. She seemed to intend to move in with Brad, but he refused her. Brad, too, was no longer in a position to support Whitney financially. After our divorce, Brad left his job due to discomfort at our shared workplace. He tried to help with the family business, but became estranged from his family and is now looking for new employment while surviving on part-time work. Of course, with alimony payments to me, his life is far from easy. Whitney moving in would be nothing but a nuisance, especially considering she played with his feelings. Shunned by her family, abandoned by Brad, and pursued by Chuck for alimony. Whitney began to drift through the night streets, escaping from everything. But she wasn't the type to attract ordinary men anymore. Once relying on her beauty, post-pregnancy Whitney did nothing to restore her figure. Losing all remnants of her past glory. Unable to escape the glory of being adored in her youth, she became obsessed with a man she met in a nightclub. drowning in debt and resorting to selling herself, she has fallen to a point of no return. Dad and Mom hired a detective agency to track Whitney's whereabouts, determined never to let her return home. They sold the family home and moved to a condominium in the next town. Mom, sharing this with me, looked sad but resolved not to extend a helping hand to Whitney. If her life were in danger, that'd be different. But that's it. We've decided not to do anything more. Mom's too gentle to bear Whitney's current state, but knows extending help again wouldn't lead to her reform. This is what being a mom is about. Though I never had children of my own, witnessing Mom's compassion and strength fills me with respect. Dad and Mom have taken in Whitney's child, who is nearly 2 years old. His rapid growth is astonishing, and I've been experiencing childcare during visits to my parents' house. I wonder what kind of adult this child without Dad or Mom will become. Yet, I'm determined to shower him with enough love to never feel lesser for it. Today, once again, I received an email from Mom about Whitney's child. We are planning to go on a trip together on the next day off. On my way home from work, I looked up at the night sky and wished for the child's growth. May he grow up to be honest, bright, and earnest. And then, I returned to my solitary apartment, where no one waits. I'm Madison. I have a husband and 2 children. After a long time, I returned to my hometown. Though I say hometown, it's actually my brother and his wife live there now. Both my parents have passed away. Looking at this house brings back memories. It's the place where the most significant event of my life took place. Now, it's a fond memory. Yes, it happened over 30 years ago. I was 32 years old and was married to a different man than my current husband. My ex-husband, John, and I were the same age. We had been married for 2 years. We didn't have any children yet. We met at work. Back then, I was a temp worker, and when I was sent to my husband's company, he was the one in charge of my training. Initially, he was reliable and decisive, which is why I married him. But gradually, I've started to notice some unsettling things. The in-laws' house, while not exactly close, is at a distance we can manage to travel if we decide to, and occasionally, I get summoned to do this or that. Sometimes I'm made to clean or cook. I'm sent shopping, and even tasked with rearranging the rooms. It's pitiful for my son to have to eat such meals every day, is a common remark. John has 2 sisters, and they both live in the in-laws' house as well. Even when I'm busy with chores at the in-laws' house, those 2 don't bother to help. Well, having them hovering around would be annoying anyway, so I don't mind, but I do wonder what they think. Do they see me as nothing more than a servant, being the wife of their brother? Since I don't live with them, I can bear it for a while and get through it without causing a fuss, as it's too much trouble to argue about every little thing. I guess this is what marriage is about. After all, we're all human, and not everyone gets along. Maybe they have complaints about me, too, and managing to get along on the surface is the best we can hope for. I try my best to follow their instructions, but the in-laws are the type to persistently nitpick and bully. I doubt I'll ever grow fond of them. And then they insist on living together. I can't comprehend the mentality of wanting to live with someone you don't like. It would be fine if John firmly refused, but for some reason, he sides with the in-laws' house and keeps nagging me. So, putting on a forced smile and skillfully dodging the issue has become our usual interaction. Until recently, John and I lived in the company housing of the company he worked for, but due to a significant change in income caused by his job change, we ended up living at my brother's house. We had to leave the company housing but couldn't find a new place to move to, and the deadline was approaching, so I consulted my brother and ended up staying with him. Incidentally, John changed jobs without consulting me. My parents moved to Anchorage, so only my brother was left at home. So now, it's John and I living with my brother in this house, which is quite spacious. Maybe that's why the in-laws' house people also wanted to move in. My brother, David, is 35 and is planning to get married in 2 months, in July. So honestly, it's not the time to let people from the in-laws' house move in, and we even want to move out before then. That's why I've been actively looking for a new place, but John doesn't seem too keen. I don't feel his intent to move out of this house. I can't just decide on a new place to move by myself, and while it's okay not to actively search for one, I at least wish he'd participate in the discussions. But whenever I talk about moving, he doesn't really listen and tries to change the subject quickly. I often wonder if he understands his position. Housework is mainly done by my brother or me, and he would casually take things from the fridge to snack on with his drinks. He seems way too relaxed. Well, I don't want him to be too mindful, but when living with your wife's brother, shouldn't a person be a bit more considerate? But then, I don't really know how people in such situations behave in other families, and maybe my husband is just tired from work. It's not something to get angry about, but I do find it somewhat awkward. One day, when my affection for my husband was gradually diminishing, an incident happened. My brother had to go on a long business trip and asked us to look after the house. So, for a while, it was just my husband and me living in the house, but then I received a call from my brother.
I had a change of plans and will be coming back today. If I make it back before dinner, let's go out and have a nice meal with your husband.
He informed me that he would be coming back earlier than planned. I had been on a day trip with a friend from early in the morning, but I planned to be back before dinner, so there was no problem. I was excited, thinking,
brother's treat.
On the way home, the roads were surprisingly clear, and the day trip ended earlier than expected. While walking home, wondering what to eat, and carrying souvenirs, I bumped into my brother on his way back. Chatting and laughing with my brother, we soon arrived in front of the house, only to see an unfamiliar truck parked there, and I could hear the voices of children and elderly people that I recognized. Wondering what it was, I saw John and his sister carrying out a familiar dresser. Moreover, the dresser they were taking was from my brother's room.
What are you doing?
I raised my voice and approached them, and his sister exclaimed, "Huh? Weren't you away on a business trip?" John turned pale.
Hey! Come here!
My brother dragged him into the house. I could hear noises coming from inside. From my brother's room. Following my brother dragging him, I headed to my brother's room, where I saw the aftermath of various items being moved out, and my husband's sister's 2 children and the in-laws freely roaming around. The one I saw in front of the house was Mia, who is 31 and married. She has 2 children, aged 6 and 4. There's also a 17-year-old sister in the in-laws' house, but she doesn't seem to be here today.
What's the meaning of this mess?
Oh? I heard you were out today.
I came back. Now, answer my question.
Well, we were thinking of moving in here.
What? Who gave you permission for that?
Permission? We're already family, so it's fine, isn't it? Besides, haven't we asked several times? And haven't we refused every time? This is utterly unreasonable. It's not a big deal. Stop being so selfish and learn to compromise a little.
Don't mess with me, old woman.
Just as I was about to get angry, my brother lost his temper. And rightly so. This is my brother's house.
This is a waste of time dealing with such idiots. Hey, kick all these people out.
My brother shouted at my husband. Mother-in-law Sophia was making a fuss about how the elderly are treated, but no one paid her any mind. The in-laws and Mia's children were pushed onto Mia, and they were forcibly sent away. My brother caught John as he was about to leave with them and angrily shoved him into the closet. Apparently, my brother was often locked in the closet when he was scolded as a child, so it was a reflex action. I was already losing affection for John, but I didn't intend to divorce him. However, this was just too much. It was a huge disappointment.
What were you doing? Please, let me out of here. Answer the question, what were you doing? Don't stay silent, answer me. I'm scared.
Scared?
Can't you explain what you've done? I'm sorry, please forgive me. Before talking about forgiving, tell me what you did. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. What kind of adult cries like that? Answer me quickly.
Realizing that this conversation was going nowhere, my brother left John locked in the closet and went to inspect the room. We caught them taking out the dresser, but who knows what else they've stolen. And there were unfamiliar items scattered around. It seems they've also brought things in from somewhere else. I was tasked with making sure John didn't escape. It appears that most of the stolen items were from my brother's room. When my brother came back and kicked the closet while yelling, John screamed inside. My brother was quite heated, so I decided to conduct the interrogation.
Hey, what were you doing? Planning to steal and sell things?
By the way, the dresser that had been moved out was ordered to be put back by the culprits themselves.
No, I wouldn't do that. Then where were you planning to take that dresser and the rest? Well,
John clammed up, so my brother kicked the closet. John answered while raising his voice.
I was going to put them in a rental storage. Why would you do that? Well,
according to him, the arrangement was for Mia's family and her children to live in the in-laws' house, and in-laws, he and I were to live in this house. Of course, I knew nothing about it. He thought that if his own room disappeared, my brother would have to move out somewhere else.
Don't you understand whose house this is? I'm sorry.
Further probing revealed that they chose my brother's room because it gets the best sunlight, planning to make it the in-laws' room. They figured once they moved in, we wouldn't have the heart to kick out the frail elderly. Also, since my brother is still single and doesn't need a large house, and since John and I might have children and need more space in the future, it seemed best to them that my brother move out. And today, they decided to go ahead with their plan since both my brother and I were supposed to be away. However, we returned earlier than they anticipated, and that's how we ended up catching them in the act.
I can't believe this guy. I had no idea he could be this foolish.
I was shocked that I failed to see how utterly unreasonable the person I married could be.
How can you even think this is okay? It's way too far-fetched. I can't understand your thought process at all.
It seemed like my brother's anger was overtaken by disbelief for a moment. Did he seriously think he could take over someone's house, force us to move out, and that we would just quietly accept it? Unless he believed the world revolved around him, I can't fathom how he came up with such an idea. Looking around my brother's room, I noticed unnatural gaps in the shelves where he kept his games and manga.
Hey, you took the games and manga, didn't you? Did you move those to the storage too?
It felt odd if he was planning to move everything to the rental storage, so I asked, and John fell silent again.
Answer me.
I pounded on the closet, urging him to respond.
I lent them to my sister. What? You can't just lend out someone else's stuff.
He was spot on.
I was planning to return them before you got back. That's not the point.
Further questioning revealed that he had been doing this for some time. Lending things out bit by bit so it wouldn't be noticed. This time, he got bold because my brother was away from home for a while.
And you took the model kits too, didn't you?
My brother loves model kits and has many in his room. Just earlier, Mia's kids had broken some, and he was furious. He also has many unopened model kits in boxes. I don't quite understand it, but it seems to be a thing among model kit enthusiasts. He's been hoarding them, planning to build them eventually. I sometimes wonder why he buys so many, but they are his, after all.
I just gave them away because my sister's kids wanted them.
John confessed in a barely audible voice.
Don't just give away someone's treasured items. Some of them are rare. Do you even understand your position? You moved in here because you don't earn enough, didn't you? And by the way, this house belongs to our parents. We've talked about this before, right? Even if you managed to drive my brother out, it wouldn't become yours. How can you not understand that? Don't disappoint me too much.
The in-laws had been demanding we live together. I always brushed them off, but maybe I should have firmly refused, considering it came to this. Though, I never could have predicted something like this. My brother dragged John out. He was almost crying. My brother made him write a letter of reflection, while John meekly wrote the letter, stumbling over his words. This wasn't the kind of situation that could be resolved with a letter of reflection. Unsure what to do, I called our parents and reported what happened. They suggested calling the police and a lawyer, so I did as advised. The lawyer gave me a number to call, which was a relief. After the lawyer arrived and we discussed the situation, it turned out that the case was somewhat ambiguous, so we ended up settling. We had the in-laws write an affidavit, agreeing to sue them in civil court only if they breached the agreement. At the same time, I also discussed the possibility of divorcing him. Since we don't have children and don't share much property, the process should be smooth. The amount I could receive from the divorce settlement would be minimal, but considering our living situation, I wasn't expecting a large sum anyway. I had Mia return the items she had borrowed earlier. My brother was checking their condition. The manga had oil stains and some scribbles on it. The games and model kits seemed to be intact. We decided to have the in-laws take back all the manga and compensate us with new ones later. It seems the in-laws are quite weak when faced with authorities like the police or lawyers, as they complied quite obediently, which was frightening in its own way. When things had somewhat calmed down, I asked John again, and it turned out he thought it was unthinkable to refuse to live with the in-laws since we got along well with them. He assumed it was just out of politeness. He was sure that deep down, we wanted to live together. He thought that my brother-in-law, being kind, would give up his room for Mia's happiness. And wouldn't kick out the elderly since he's so kind. He was convinced that my brother would agree. I sighed. Did John mistake me and my brother for saints or something? Sure, I don't like the in-laws, but as a wife, I tried to maintain a proper relationship, and thanks to that, things seemed to go quite well on the surface. My brother also treated John with a certain degree of courtesy because he was my husband. I guess that's why he got the impression that we are kind people. But that's just a normal part of human interaction. In maintaining smooth human relations, people put on a mask, so to speak, utter social niceties, and say things they don't mean. And the other person, understanding that, doesn't take the words or attitudes at face value but tries to imagine the real intention behind them and thinks about how to react appropriately. In this way, while gauging the distance between each other, if one thinks the other person is someone they can get closer to, they gradually show their true selves. John was fatally bad at this. He tried to fit other people's feelings into a frame that was convenient for him. That's not how human relationships work. I explained all this to him. It might have been the last bit of sentiment I had for him as his wife. There are rare individuals who are thoroughly bad at this. Through interacting and engaging with many people in life, one gradually comes to understand and practice this. It's hard to explain and even harder to teach. The only solution is to gain experience by interacting with many people. I told him that this was what he needed. Whether he took my rather self-righteous lecture as just an expression of my anger or as words born from consideration for him, I left that for him to decide. At that point, I didn't feel enough attachment left to bother myself with him anymore. The in-laws were generally quiet. It seemed they were worried that legal action might affect the younger sister's education and future prospects. When I mentioned divorce,
You can't just decide to leave him.
they initially protested. Shall we proceed with mediation, then? She fell silent. It turned out that Mia and her family were the reason why the in-laws wanted to move into our house. Mia had moved back into the in-laws' house some time ago, but she didn't do any housework, and her husband, despite working, didn't contribute to the household expenses. Her children were noisy and destructive, interfering with the younger sister's study for her exams. They thought our house would be quieter, and it would be an opportunity to educate me as a wife. They figured that once they moved their stuff in, we wouldn't be able to object strongly, and given the circumstances, we would accept them. This was how they convinced John and led to this whole mess. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I felt utterly drained all at once. John was currently packing up the items he had brought from the in-laws' house. A moving company was scheduled to pick them up in the afternoon. Of course, the in-laws were going to cover the cost. I was ready to put an end to this, but my brother seemed unsatisfied. Determined to straighten out John's character, he had him doing housework and cleaning. Until now, John always excused himself from helping by saying, "I'm too tired," while my brother and I did all the housework. Maybe my brother had also had enough of it. John had been too relaxed in our house, freely eating and drinking whatever he liked without helping with chores. It was okay, but it was frustrating how he just went about his business without a word, and things would be gone before we knew it. My brother wanted to settle that score before kicking him out. By the way, John and I were sleeping in separate rooms. We ate separately, and I didn't keep any personal gadgets like phones or computers in his room, just housing magazines. And miraculously, the divorce was finalized, and he finally left the house. The other day, my brother and I reminisced about the whole ordeal. After all that, I met another man, built a family, and now it's been over 30 years. Life sure has its ups and downs, but being able to look back calmly probably means I'm happy now.